The American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom documented 1,247 demands to censor library books and resources in 2023. The number of titles targeted for censorship surged 65% in 2023 compared to 2022, reaching the highest levels ever documented in more than 20 years of tracking. Specifically, 4,240 unique book titles were targeted for removal from schools and libraries. As high-profile censorship challenges continue with worrying frequency, it is important to acknowledge that censorship in a variety of forms is also happening here in Charlotte and the surrounding areas. And to learn what we can do to support and protect the freedom of information, we're having this program. For over 40 years, Banned Book Weeks has focused on reading and spotlighting current and historical attempts to censor books in libraries and schools. Tonight's informational panel aims to bring together community members in shared support of the freedom to seek and to express ideas, even those some consider unorthodox or unpopular. It is not intended to be an event that includes all viewpoints, nor serve as a forum for political polarization. Tonight, the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library is here with an exceptional panel of experts who will engage in open conversation about the dangers of book banning and censorship and the importance of free expression and First Amendment rights. I'm MT and I'm your host, but by day I'm also your CEO and Chief Librarian of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. And on behalf of the 470 staff who work for us, we're excited to protect your right to read and your right to have access to all of the views that you may espouse. As one of the leading libraries in our country, I always judge a library by the content of its catalog, how many books it has, and whether they have books on every subject. I am proud to say that we are an amazing library system because here at Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, we have something to offend everyone. And with that, I'll introduce you to our panel. I'm going to introduce our four impressive panelists, but wanted to start by giving you an overview of the event. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes tonight, and then we'll open the floor to a Q&A led by Megan Anderson. So start thinking about any questions you would like to ask. You may put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any point during our discussion. And here's our panel. Dr. Mark West is a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he has been teaching courses on children's and young adult literature since 1984. He has written or edited 19 books, including 2 books that deal with censorship: Trust Your Children, Voices Against Censorship in Children's Literature, and Children, Culture, and Controversy. He's going to give us an overview of the origins and history of American censorship and how it has evolved over the years based on political climate. Our second guest is Mollie Burkholder. Mollie is the Educational Programs Manager for PFLAG Charlotte. They also work as an instructional design and organizational development consultant in the field of international development, and they have served as an LGBTQ+ health advocate across the globe. They are going to provide perspective on the current trend of record-high book bans targeting LGBTQ content and what they may mean for the queer community and its allies. Welcome, Mollie. Ashley Belote. And finally, we have Ashley, acclaimed picture book author and illustrator of Listen Up, Luella. I saw that book on the shelf today. Witch and Wombat, Don't Wash Winston, and most recently, Sheepwrecked. She also serves as the illustrator coordinator for the Carolinas chapter of Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. She will, of course, be giving us the author and illustrator perspective on challenging, banning, and silencing. Ashley, thank you for joining us. So let's start with Dr. West. Dr. West, since you've written 2 books on censorship, can you kick us off by giving us the quick overview, maybe 5 minutes, of the origins of censorship? I know you mentioned that it ties innately to the Western world ideas in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries of the innocent child and the desire to protect. Can you talk us through where it first appeared and some of the bigger shifts that have occurred?
Well, sure, I'm happy to, MT. So the idea of censorship goes way, way, way back. But in terms of the censorship of children's literature per se, is something that really became a significant movement in the years right after the Civil War. One of the things that was popular among working class readers during the Civil War period was something that came to be known as dime novels. Dime novels were exciting stories aimed at working class readers that had, oftentimes they were Westerns. Sometimes they were detective stories. They were sensational. They weren't great literature from a writing point of view, but they were exciting. They appealed to readers who wanted not uplift, but they wanted excitement. Well, dime novels were not initially intended for children, but as their name suggests, they were pretty affordable. And in those days, some children could afford dime novels on their own. I mean, they were making the purchasing decisions on their own. Most children's literature prior to that was the economic system was one by which parents and grandparents and well-meaning adults would provide children with books that they thought would be good for them, that the kids would enjoy, but also that they would learn from. The term we used for the children's literature from that time period was didactic. They were almost always instructive. And they taught good lessons in some instances, but they were books that were not the books the kids themselves selected. They were books that well-meaning adults would select and give to kids. But they were kind of boring. I've read a whole bunch of them. I own more didactic children's books from the 19th century than I'm sure the library does. But the thing is, it wasn't to all children's tastes. But when these dime novels showed up at the drugstore and available in different ways, kids started to say, hey, you know, this looks a lot more interesting. Oh, sure, they were full of all sorts of stereotypes and whatnot, but they were exciting. They were what they sometimes refer to as blood and thunder. Well, the kids liked them. And when the publishers who were of dime novels, Beadle and Adams and others, when they discovered there was this untapped market of kids that were going to buy books on their own, they said, oh, well, we had never even thought of that as a possible market for our publications. So here's what they did. They brought the cost of dime novels down to a nickel, but they didn't change the name. I mean, sometimes they call them nickel papers, but generally they were called dime novels, but especially the ones marketed to kids were generally a nickel. They really weren't, they were like novellas, pamphlets almost in terms of length. They were very, very cheaply produced. That's why there's so few of them today, because they were made on such cheap paper that they disintegrated quickly. But they were popular, and they caused some concern. Now, there was a very famous man in the 19th century named Anthony Comstock. Anthony Comstock, you recognize his name because of the Comstock Act, which is something that's just surfaced recently in our own political environment. But Anthony Comstock got it into his head that the main cause of juvenile crime, because we started to see the rise of juvenile crime with the rise of cities, New York and Philadelphia and Boston and such. He said, well, the main cause for juvenile crime are dime novels. So he launched a campaign to ban dime novels. And it was amazingly effective. He did all sorts of things. He encouraged book bannings, book burnings. He encouraged all sorts of ways to suppress and put out of business the publishers of dime novels. He had a connection to the post office, and he revoked the second-class mailing licenses for the dime novel publishers so that they couldn't mail them at the rate of a magazine or a newspaper, even though that's the size that they were, in a way to undermine the economics of dime novels. That was the first really big censorship case in the history of children's literature in America. And it was big. I mean, it laid the groundwork for the future campaigns against certain forms of children's popular culture. In fact, the very argument that Frederick Wertham made against comic books in the 1950s with his book Seduction of the Innocent were made by Anthony Comstock in the 1880s, and his book called Traps for the Young. So that was the beginning of censorship in children's literature in any big scale, like we're seeing today, a big scale thing. I don't mean an isolated case here, an isolated case there, but something that was larger scale. That was when it started, and it's continued in waves, up and down over the years. What causes the censorship, the forms of literature that get people riled up have actually changed over the years, but the arguments are similar in that the people will argue, well, these books are causing our children, they're corrupting our children, is what is the general argument. That idea that books can corrupt children is rooted, as you were suggesting, MT, before, is rooted in the idea of childhood innocence, that you have to shelter children from all things that you don't like, because if you drop a little drop of red ink into the pure glass of sparkling water, you'll never be able to get it pure again. That's actually from a quotation from Anthony Comstock. Why you can never let a child read a dime novel, because they'll be forever corrupted and their life will be ruined from then on, and before you know it, they're going to do terrible things. It's all because of the dime novel. Well, as the years went by, other types of books became censored, oftentimes tied to political movements or some personal crusade of a particular person. During the rise of what some people refer to, and I still use the term, the word new realism, as a term we use to describe more realistic, more true to life, realistic children's books that started to come out in the 60s and 70s. Books like Harriet the Spy, and books like Judy Blume's books, books like The Outsiders, if you're familiar with that book, or Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich. These were books that were tied to what came to be known as the New Realism movement. And they oftentimes would acknowledge, though never go into great detail, children's natural curiosity about sexuality. So the big censorship cases of that time period were about, like Judy Blume's references to, it's not just sexuality, but physicality itself. So everybody got riled up about Judy Blume's Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, because it talks openly about a girl getting her period. During the 1980s, the big wave was against what they saw as demonic sort of children's books that celebrated witches, in their opinion, witchcraft. And the main target at that point was, as you were suggesting, was the Harry Potter books. But other books came along as well. Nowadays, the argument is made against books that deal with openly with racism in the children's book, and books that deal with trans kids and gay kids and the controversy surrounding that. But the argument is almost always the same. These books will corrupt innocent children, and children, oh, you can let adults read them, but you can't let kids read them, because if you let kids read them, they'll be forever corrupted. That's exactly what Comstock said in the 1880s, and it's what people are still saying to this very day. But because it still resonates with our idea of innocent childhood, it still reaches people, even though the targeted books have changed over the years.
Thank you. You named a few books that I had forgotten about or hadn't realized some were on there. For your book, Trust Your Children, you interviewed lots of authors and publishers about censorship. Can you give us a few fun author facts you picked up along the way?
Sure. So when I came to UNC Charlotte in 1984, was when we saw that big wave of censorship, especially related to what was then called New Realism. And books were being attacked and targeted at schools and public libraries. And people were saying all sorts of terrible things about the authors of these books. And it seemed to me that authors should have a chance to defend themselves, but they can't go to every school board meeting to defend their book. So I had this brilliant idea, I thought, that I would travel around the country and interview authors whose books were censored. And that's why I know so many authors, is because I literally got a small grant and I traveled all over the place and I met all sorts of authors and everybody was so nice. So that's how I got to know, all sorts of authors over that time period. And then that's continued on. The very first author I interviewed was Judy Blume. And I had never interviewed an author before. I was just a young man at the time. I'm not a young man anymore, but I was then. One of the nice things about interviewing Judy Blume is that she showed me in our conversation, it was not really an interview, it was a conversation. When I transcribed it and turned it into the interview in the book, I made it look more like a Q&A, but what it was really, all the things that the author said was correct. This is a little secret for you. I transcribed everything the authors said. Took me hours and hours and hours because I'm no good at that sort of thing, but I transcribed it. And then I said, okay, what question could have I asked that would have elicited this response? And then I pretended that's what I said. But in many cases, it wasn't what I said. But it seemed like I was using the questions as a transition from one point to another point. So oftentimes I would just have these conversations with authors. But one of the things that I learned from Judy, for example, is her, I don't want to offend anybody, nobody can answer this given this forum, but her most censored book, Judy Blume's most censored book, was a book called Beanie. And it's a book about a girl who has scoliosis. And she doesn't know why she has scoliosis. What's wrong? What could have she done? Well, the gym class has a little box and you can ask questions in the story. You can ask questions to the gym teacher and then she can answer the questions anonymously. So Deanie writes a question and she says, she's very concerned about why she has scoliosis, this curvature of the spine. And what Judy Blume writes about is in the book is the girl writes this question. It takes about 2 paragraphs in the book. Is there a place where if you touch yourself, it can have serious problems? Can it cause serious problems? Anonymous, he didn't sign it. And the gym teacher says, well, the word you're trying to use is masturbation, and no, it has no physical consequences. It is 2 paragraphs. It caused that book. It came out in the 70s. It caused that book more than anything else. That book to be censored at one point. It was the most censored book in America because of those 2 paragraphs. So I asked her about it, and she said, "Well, I interviewed lots and lots of kids who had scoliosis, and I wanted to just be true to reality, and that was a concern some kids had because nobody would talk openly about this topic, and she felt that she should bring it out in the book." And it made perfect sense in that context. But if I hadn't talked to her about that, I would not have understood why she brought that up. Another author I talked to, he was a cantankerous old guy, but it was still interesting to talk to him, was Maurice Sendak. Maurice Sendak came to Charlotte at one point as part of Novello way back when. But when I interviewed him on the telephone, which one of the few interviews I did by the telephone, but he wasn't willing for me to fly up to Connecticut and interview him in person. But he talked about, his most censored book, as you probably know, is Mickey in the Night Kitchen, because it has the portrayal of nudity in it. And so I talked to him about that. And he said, this story came right out of my dreams as a boy. He wrote a lot about dreams, and he had a very good recall of not just the circumstances of his childhood, but also his interior life in his childhood. And so he explained in the interview, I thought he did a great job of explaining why does Mickey fall out of his clothes. It's part of this dream fantasy sequence. It's very dreamlike. So you see, it was just very interesting to me to actually talk to these authors about their books, begin to understand what motivated them, begin to understand why they felt it was important to keep their books the way they intended it, rather than have it edited or censored. A lot of the censorship that happens in children's literature, in a way, happens before you ever see the book. It's the interactions between the author, the illustrator, and the editors and publishers who say, you know, I was just talking to a picture book author right here in Charlotte, and he's saying, he came to one of my talks and he said how frustrated he was as an illustrator. He's a pretty prominent illustrator, but I don't have his permission to use his name, so I won't mention it. But he was saying, I can't even include a belly button in my picture books. He said, all kids have belly buttons. But my editors will say, you know, is it really necessary for this kid to have a belly button? Well, what's wrong with this? You know, all kids have belly buttons. There's nothing wrong with that. But somehow or another, in the minds of the editors, they were saying, let's just not get people riled up. We're just not going to have any belly buttons, not in this picture book. So we don't even know that when he did the initial illustrations, the kid had a belly button, but he was required before the book was ever published to make sure that you could not see the belly button for whatever reason. Talking to authors themselves lets you know about those kinds of situations that they have to face.
That's so very true. I know there was a book a couple of years ago where the author was challenged by her publisher or at least the editor to change a word in the book. And if we have time, we'll talk about that a little later. But I have one more question for you. Since you teach children's literature at the college and graduate level, this topic surely comes up in your classes. Can you give us an example of a controversial text you might teach or how you might address issues in classic literature that might be problematic when viewed through today's cancel culture lens?
Yeah, so I've been talking, censorship is not a left-right thing. There's censorship pressure that comes from all sides of the political spectrum. The people who censor on the left oftentimes don't like to use the word censorship, but that's essentially, to use the phrase you just used, cancel culture is a form of censorship. So I think I am probably, for example, one of the last children's literature professors who teaches A Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I teach it in the context of historical fiction, and I put it in the context of the American West and all of the contradictions that took place in the settlement of the West. When I teach that book, and oddly enough, I'm going to teach it on Thursday, but when I teach that book, I just take it as what some people call a teachable moment. It gives me an opportunity to talk about how the settlement of the West impacted the American Indians who were living there first. But what I talk about in the context of censorship and cancel culture and those kinds of things is, rather than say we should never allow this book to be read anymore, I say, let's talk about this book and why did she write this way and what kind of values does it reflect? And then I also like to get students, and they are so good about this, to talk about point of view. Okay, so we have this family that's a line jumping family. That's what they are back in those days with the Homesteading Act and whatnot. There were certain areas that were opened up for homesteading and certain places were not. And then there were some people like the Ingalls family that jumped the line, and they were called line jumpers to see if they could get the best land. And that's really what's going on in A Little House on the Prairie. But I said, okay, well, let's look at it from the Indians' point of view. Now, how would have they regarded, they just signed a treaty a few years before that this area was going to be their territory and that side of the line was going to be the settlers' territory. And now here comes this family crossing the line. It's against the treaty. What should we do with them? And that, in fact, is something that really, truly happened. It gives an opportunity to talk about those things. I think I have a tremendous respect for the intelligence of children. I think you can talk to children about all sorts of things if you provide them with some context, a little bit of history, and give them an opportunity to ask questions. So I think actually I've had some of the most interesting conversations I've had with my students about these kinds of topics surrounding Little House on the Prairie. If I just said, okay, I'm never going to teach Little House on the Prairie anymore because it has racist depictions of American Indians, and that it does, I would have never been able to have that rich conversation. So to me, it's I'm not saying that all books should be like that, but I do think there's an opportunity sometimes to talk about these books in a more complex sort of way. I could go on and on and on about that. Another author I thought I'd mention regarding that is Roald Dahl. I got to know Roald Dahl. I wrote a whole book about Roald Dahl. It was one of the most memorable days of my life when I flew to England and spent a day with Roald Dahl. But some people say this similar things about Roald Dahl because, boy, he's kind of got a some people say Roald Dahl was the nicest person in the world, and some people say Roald Dahl was an SOB. Here's the truth. He was both. And I saw both sides of it. But one of the things that I really hate are when editors are going in now years after Roald Dahl has died and rewriting his books to make them more in line with their value systems. It's like, you can comment and say, I don't really like the way witches are portrayed in Matilda, and not Matilda, I'm the witches, but that's one thing. It's quite another thing to say, I think Roald Dahl really meant to say this, and we're not even going to tell people that we just rewrote this whole sentence. That to me is not acceptable. It's a form of censorship that is not acceptable to me. And I'll always draw attention to it if somebody does that, that this is a valorization of what was the author's actual wording.
Thanks for that, Mark. And Ashley, I hope you're taking a lot of notes because he's set up a lot of spaces for you to have comments on, as well as you, Mollie. So thanks for doing that, Mark. We're going to switch over now to talk with Mollie a bit, which is on to the present, where the struggle is current in the way that book bans are targeting LGBTQ content, reaching record high levels. In 2022, over half of the year's most challenged books had queer or trans themes. Mollie, I'm going to ask two questions. One is not on our list, so my apologies, but I think it might be helpful. Some of our viewers or attendees may not know what PFLAG is, and I use that as an introduction. So if you'll tell us what PFLAG is, and then can you tell us a bit about what PFLAG does both nationally and locally to support the queer community, both in general and in the face of these challenges? And by tell us about it, I meant tell us what the acronym stands for.
Yes, absolutely. So it's actually interesting. So PFLAG was founded in 1973. A mom in New York City went to the Christopher Street Parade which would then become New York City Pride with her son, Morty Manford was a prominent gay activist at the time. She went to the parade, held up a sign that said, parents, support your gay and lesbian children, or something to that effect. She also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times urging other parents to do the same, talking about the importance of vocally supporting their gay and lesbian children. And tons of folks responded to that op-ed, saying, we love our gay son, we love our lesbian daughter, but it's challenging, especially given the cultural climate at the time. So they started a meeting in a church basement, which eventually became Parents, Friends, and Family of Lesbians and Gays. Now, as the organization has evolved, we have sort of dropped using what the acronym stands for, because it's not inclusive of trans folks and other gender nonconforming people. But because there's some brand recognition with PFLAG, we still use that, similarly to how we don't use some of the words in the acronym NAACP, but the NAACP is still called that because folks know what it is and what they do. So that's to just give an explanation of the acronym. We just sort of say we're simply PFLAG these days, but that's the history of that term. So since the 70s, when PFLAG was founded, it has grown to become a national organization with local affiliate chapters across the country. We talk about ourselves as the first and largest LGBTQ ally-focused organization in the US. So PFLAG Charlotte was founded in 1987. And our mission, in alignment with PFLAG National, is to create a more just, affirming, and caring world for LGBTQ folks and those who love them. And so At the national level, PFLAG hosts virtual meetings for loved ones of queer folks from a lot of different affinity groups, including AAPI families, Black families, military families, Latin American community, people with trans loved ones. They recently started a specific group for grandparents, which I love. There's also a ton of resources that target those different groups and how we support them specifically. And they're also all available in Spanish. And then specifically PFLAG Charlotte, what we do is sort of 3 program areas. One being those community support meetings, which we have monthly in Charlotte, up in North Meck and Huntersville, down in Union County. We have a meeting that's in Spanish that is hosted by the Latin American Coalition. And then we have a group called Faith and Allyship that is specifically for folks that have questions around religion and spirituality and faith and LGBTQ identity and allyship. And then we also do educational programming, helping folks I go into local businesses, schools, healthcare settings, churches, what have you, to just do some education on things like LGBTQ terminology and then specific best practices to make your space more inclusive for LGBTQ folks. And then we also do a lot of advocacy work in conjunction with national. And right now, a lot of that is focused on voter registration efforts, letting people know what resources are available to help them get registered, to learn about what issues might be on the ballot in their state, local, and at the federal level that affect the LGBTQ community. And then also helping local chapters sort of organize those efforts. And then last year, PFLAG National launched a Reading with Love campaign. And so that encourages folks to donate books that celebrate diversity and or are banned to their local libraries, provides resources on how to speak out as an advocate at your local school board meetings or city council, how to report censorship, and also how-to guides for hosting things like a banned books read-in. So does that answer your question? I know I was rambling a bit.
No, you weren't rambling. And what I found interesting is that as you described each of the things that PFLAG does, you started with, and we do a lot of, and we do a lot of, and then I was like, you all do a lot of.
We do. That is true. Yeah. And we are a staff of 4 plus an intern, and only one of us is full-time. So that is, that's the community advocacy nonprofit life. But we love it.
I bet. I have another question for you. Right now, it feels like book bans are being coordinated at a time when LGBTQ youth and families are scared and struggling. Can you talk about what it would mean to take these resources away?
Absolutely. The political and social climate right now can be incredibly isolating. And so that isolation and disconnection, these are tools used by oppressive systems, right? As people who have a marginalized aspect of our identity, if we feel alone in our struggles for respect, for equity, inclusion, equal protection under the law, it makes us more likely to give up or to buy into the narratives about how another marginalized group are the problem. And then we lose sight of the fact that those systems and those folks who are in power within those systems are the source of our issues, not each other, right? We see this a lot with, I would say a good example would be people who have been convinced that the problem in impoverished rural areas is immigrant labor, not lack of investment in community, but that's a whole nother soapbox. But when we fight back against that isolation and connect to each other, connect to that collective power and support each other, that's when movement building and change can happen. And taking that possibility away from young people, in people in the queer community, particularly youth, is sort of on trend right now. You know, for kids to grow into happy, successful adults, they need to be able to grow, to play, and to learn. So this slate of hate that we've seen in North Carolina and other states across the country targets exactly those things. So queer and trans kids are being denied access to gender affirming care. We know that leads to increased mental health struggles and suicidality. They're rendered unable to grow up happy and healthy. Trans students, particularly trans girls, are being denied access to sports, which provides opportunity for improving physical and mental health, helps kids make friends, teaches important skills like teamwork, discipline. And then in terms of formal learning, there's already so little representation of queer stories, and banning books just really exacerbates that issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to follow up on the trend part of it because in libraries, I think as we deal with censorship in various forms, some of the topics, specifically LGBTQ, doesn't appear to be a trend to us. Every year we can expect something. But talk to us about trends in this arena.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think when youth are exploring or struggling with their gender identity or their sexuality, seeing themselves represented in media, in stories, is really important to imagining a future where they can live full, happy lives and as their authentic selves and grow up to adulthood. You know, if you can see it, you can be it. Having access to stories about whether they're fiction or about LGBTQ figures throughout history can be a lifeline for kids who don't live in a supportive home or a supportive community. Allowing those kids to see examples of queer people who have done great things, whether it's Langston Hughes or Sylvia Rivera, Sally Ride, Megan Rapinoe, Sappho, pretty much any male Greek philosopher, right? These folks who have, you know, different sexual orientations or gender identities. Those visible examples are so important for kids to be able to see themselves in history and in literature. You know, and these visible examples are just as important for cisgender or heterosexual people and kids, whether they're vocal allies or skeptics. You know, if every reader can access stories with queer and trans characters, that can only lead to further understanding and inclusion of those diverse identities in other aspects of mainstream culture. You know, and I think this is top of mind for me because I'm in addition to being a huge bookworm, I also in a former younger life was a big sports person, and thinking about the Olympics, you know, censorship goes beyond book banning when it comes to LGBTQ stuff, and this anti-trans rhetoric that we're seeing that's sort of, you know, become this hot button issue hurts everybody. You know, the same narratives that are used to ban gender affirming care are used to restrict access to reproductive health. You know, transphobia also hurts cisgender people. I think about the sports thing is thinking about Amani Khalif, who is the Algerian boxer who won the gold medal in Paris. She's from a country where it's illegal to be trans. Her dad didn't want to let her be a boxer because it wasn't ladylike, but because she doesn't fit the image of, you know, sort of like demure, cutesy, small, soft-spoken little lady, some transphobic people with huge platforms on social media took the opportunity to call her a man as an attempt to discredit her. And that type of rhetoric doesn't just harm trans people, but also any little girl who's watching, because they're hearing that there's a right way to be a girl, and that's not someone who is strong or outspoken or confident in themselves and their abilities. But to come back to the idea of this being a trend, right? There's this narrative that queerness and a particularly diverse gender identities are this like new phenomenon, sort of like this product of woke culture run amok, when that's just not true. You know, scores of non-Western cultures have recognized gender diversity throughout history. The most famous images that we have of Nazi book burning are from a German doctor who was doing research on queer and trans people. And so the queer community is not a stranger to censorship and repression, but you know, queer people have existed as long as people have existed. Our histories have been erased, our stories have been erased because our existence challenges the status quo that and lets people see that they can exist outside of potentially restrictive cultural narratives about gender roles, gender expression, those narratives that uphold these systems like patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. But that challenge is why it's so important for us to fight against censorship like book banning, fight against the repression of our stories, because we can, as queer folks, be an example of how to advocate for yourselves and other vulnerable people in our communities.
I think, thank you for that. I mildly tracked on the Olympics this year. I wasn't watching every night, but I certainly watched the stories and the discussions that occurred around that particular boxer and the athlete that you mentioned, and just wonder when we'll have that book about her. So it'll just be interesting. But now we move over to an actual author of children's books, and that's Ashley Belote. Ashley, you provide not only an author perspective, but also an illustrator perspective. How have all these recent book challenges affected the illustration community? Is it different or similar? And certainly Dr. West shared with us a story of someone whose artistic talents and creativity were challenged with a simple fact of a belly button.
Yes, it is totally relevant. And I'd like to describe book bans as a domino effect. When you ban a book and you ban a creator, then that creator's illustrator is also in that same boat. And then those stories aren't getting out to the kids who need to read them. And what that does is it keeps the kids from being able to form their own opinions. And if nobody in the world has an opinion, how are they supposed to write their own stories in the future? You know, so there's absolutely no reason for these things to be happening, because all we're doing is hurting ourselves in the long run. Life would be so boring if we all thought the same way. So in terms of illustration, it's the same thing. It would be so boring if we all drew the same thing. And I'm an author illustrator, but I'm an illustrator first. And some things that I have found, there were over 1,200 creators affected by book bans last year. And of those 1,200 people, 243 of them were illustrators. And even though we are not in the majority of those affected, it's still a significant percentage. And, you know, art, the definition of art is freedom of expression. And when those things are challenged, why am I doing this job? Like, to me, and so many illustrators like me, being an artist is part of our identity. You know, we are our job. There's no distinction between Ashley the person and Ashley the artist. That's, you know, to me, one and the same. And if I'm not able to freely express myself, it's awful. It's, you know, it's a personal attack as well as a professional attack. Going back to what Dr. West was saying, by the way, Dr. West, you have interviewed some fantastic people. I'm over here like so entranced by what you're saying. That is so cool.
Thanks.
Judy Bloom, hello, that rocks. But you know, having the ability to talk about these things with such influential people, gosh, I mean, the more that we talk about these things, the better. So, you know, referencing the belly button comment, I was working on a book, and I was drawing like a living room scene, and I wanted to put like, you know, a scene with like a wall and a couch and a lamp and stuff. And I was drawing an outlet, like a plug, and I wasn't allowed to put the outlet in there because they said if kids see that, they'll want to go find real outlets and stick their fingers in them. Okay. So, but that, you know, that type of comment is not consistent across publishing. You know, there's so many people are, you know, kind of picking and choosing where to censor and what to censor. And that's another form of censorship. So, you know, the lack of consistency, I think, in all of this is something else that, you know, we could have a whole nother discussion on. But one thing about the kidlit community is, gosh, we are supportive of one another. Oh man. So it's kind of like an all for one and one for all type of situation. So if one book is banned, it affects all of us. And it inhibits us from doing our job, which is to show kids the world in an imaginative space and to allow them to form thoughts and opinions and create things in their own imaginations. So, like I said in the beginning, it is truly a domino effect. And when you prevent creative people from being creative, they're not doing the world any service. And if you think back to, you know, artists throughout history, the ones who are the most renowned are the ones who shook things up. And they, by censoring us now, they're preventing the next Picasso. They're preventing the next, you know, big deal artist who's going to challenge the norms of society. And, you know, not every artist uses their art in the same way. And that's also fine. You know, we should be able to express ourselves however, you know, we want our art to affect the world. I know with my books personally, I've worked on 2 Halloween books. One of them is called Frankenslime, and that's this one, about a little girl scientist. And the other one is Witch and Wombat, about a little witch who has a wombat familiar instead of a cat. And there's been several times where I've been at events or whatever, and, you know, presenting these books to people, and they say, oh, we don't do witches, we don't do Halloween. And they just don't look at those books. They look at other books instead. And that is fine. Not everybody needs to like the same thing, but what they can't do is prevent other kids who might like books about witches from seeing them. So you're totally allowed to have opinions. That's fine, but you shouldn't try to force those opinions on other people, especially kids, because those, like I said, that is the next generation of creatives. And we need more Picassos. We need more everything. Also, I just want to shout out quickly, Rebecca. I read your question in the chat, and I know that is directed at Mollie, but I do have a book recommendation for you. The name of the book is called Kyle's Colorful Life by Dreama McNeil. It is a fantastic book that is directed. It is all about children on the autism spectrum. And it uses beautiful, vibrant color illustrations and talks about how autistic kids really respond well to those types of images. So again, that artist was free to draw whatever she wanted. And, you know, because of that, we ended up with a really great book out in the world that deals with those kids with those types of, in those types of situations. So I just wanted to quickly throw that in there for you.
Thanks, Ashley. I do want to, I know we have a few questions in the Q&A, and I know Megan's going to key us up for that, but I do have one more question for you as a follow-up, Ashley. The world of writing, authorship, illustration mesmerizes me. I have no talents in any of those areas whatsoever. How do, and I presume, and my apologies that I don't know this, I presume you've been illustrators for other authors.
Yes.
How do you work together to get that interpretation so you're listing out what they really want to talk about in a particular book? Because I can think that if an author wanted to talk about an LGBTQ issue, but they wanted an illustrator and they are somewhat on different pages, how do you work through those things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think the publishing industry is set up to where it tries to avoid those types of issues as much as possible by giving each person their own creative space. So when they pair an author and an illustrator together for a project, we're actually not really allowed to contact each other. I mean, we can, of course, if we want to, we can, but what they do is an editor gets a manuscript and then they choose an illustrator, and then that illustrator creates the artwork. There is no collaboration that's going on, at least in the traditional major publishing house world. Now, I come from an indie publishing background where I used to be hired directly by authors. And in that world of indie publishing, that collaboration exists a lot more. But with the mainstream traditional houses, they keep you separated because they want the author to do their creative part, and then they want the illustrator to do their creative part. And I think that by allowing each person their own space to bring their vision, they are giving each creator that freedom so that you don't have influence one way or the other. Now, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, and those working in the indie publishing world, can potentially run into issues like that. But I feel like if you are working in that space and you're an author hiring an illustrator, if you have such specific visions for a book, then you should probably maybe just illustrate it yourself. Because there's, I've had some amazing collaborations, and I've also had some frustrating collaborations where, that I was hired, and I had a different idea of what certain characters should look like or do, and that wasn't, what the author had envisioned. And again, it's totally fine to have your own opinions, but allow each person to have their own, type of creative space. So some people have such a specific vision, and if so, that's fine. You should do what you want to. But if you really want to hire somebody, allow them to bring their own vision to it, because picture books in particular, they are such a marriage of text and illustration. And the illustration shouldn't show exactly what the text says. Otherwise, you're just getting it twice. Illustration should illustrate beyond the text and show us what else is happening in the story. And if it's important what the character looks like, for the story to move forward, you can discuss that. But typically it should, generally be up to the illustrator what that character looks like and, how they are perceived by others. So it's a fine line, but allowing each person to have their own creative space is of utmost importance.
So 2 points to that. The first one being to Dr. West's point, a belly button could appear and surprise both the author and the publisher, which is always good. And then the second, and I am a big proponent of this, I do judge a book by its cover, especially children's books.
Yeah.
They are absolutely beautiful and tell a whole story that says, go pick me up. So really great with that. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I know that we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Megan Anderson, who's going to lead us through the Q&A. Thanks, Megan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. I work at the South Boulevard Library. Before I get to the wonderful questions you guys have posed, I put all your names in a raffle drawing for a banned book, and Gina Petrie, I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, you won. And so if you could chat me, and I enabled it so that you could, your preferred branch location, I will send you a banned book and some library swag. I'll also give you a small choice in banned books. They're very good. We have All the Boys Aren't Blue. Sorry, my blur. Bluest Eye, a blue theme, and drama. Anyway, please message me. And as far as questions, we'll get to them. So the first question is for Dr. West. We know you talked about a few texts that you teach your students, but is there another text that you teach that particularly riles up students in the age of cancel culture, or I guess like presently?
Well, One of the nice things about teaching children's literature at the college level is that students are oftentimes receptive to talking about a wide variety of books. They're already sort of geared up to talking about books and looking at them in a complex way from different points of view. I do think that one of the authors that I mentioned earlier that some students really don't want to read now, and I've taught it quite a number of times, is in fact J.K. Rowling. So with the Harry Potter books. So when I teach the Harry Potter books, there's still a tremendous fan base out there for Harry Potter. If you've ever been to Universal down there in Florida and seen the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, it's just an amazing place. It's absolutely amazing. But then how do you reconcile the context, these stories with some of the statements that J.K. Rowling has made, or Joanne Kathleen Rowling has made, in expressing her own transphobic sort of way of looking at a certain population base? One of the things I always tried to say when I'm teaching is that the text and the author are overlapping Venn diagrams, but they're not one and the same. So sometimes you can really enjoy a story or a work of art by a particular person, but you might not actually like everything that that person has said or done over the course of their lives. What I try to tell students is that the art and the creator are obviously linked, but if you're going to say, I'm never going to read a book by this particular author because this author said something at some point that was really offensive, and I'm not trying to say that it isn't offensive, but then it ends up becoming a form of judgment that rules out some interesting art. Now, my wife doesn't always agree with me about this. I'm a First Amendment absolutist. So, but for example, I grew up, my father was I grew up watching Woody Allen films. And I liked Annie, and I liked some of those old original ones. And then we found out these deplorable things about some of the behavior of Woody Allen. So one of the movies I liked, in fact, one of the first movies I took my wife to when we were dating was called Radio Days. Have you ever seen Radio Days? It's a fantastic movie. It really deals with that whole 1930s, 40s radio culture and how important it was in American popular culture during that time period. And I'll still stand by that movie. I enjoyed that movie. I thought it was an interesting movie. It's not one of his more famous movies, but I thought it was an interesting movie. But I can understand her point of view. She says, I just don't want to go to a movie now that I know what I know about Woody Allen's personal life. So I respect her judgment. I would never ask her to go to a movie that would offend her in that way. And she knows I still like Radio Days. So, sometimes these things get complicated. The main time where that comes up in my classes where it actually, you get the most offended or hurt when it's something that you love and it seems like the person has just betrayed you. It's like, how could you do that to me? I was a damn Gryffindor and look what you've done to me. I feel like you've betrayed this part of my childhood. But what I try to tell my students when we talk about this, and we do talk about it, is you can still be a Gryffindor, but that doesn't mean that you have to ascribe to all the things that she has said in certain kinds of contexts. You don't have to buy, it's not a 2-for-1 deal necessarily. On the other hand, there are lots and lots of other fantasy books out there, tremendous number of other fantasy books out there. So if that's not a book that you want to read, hey, I could recommend a whole bunch of other books that you might like that are similar in tone, that have a different kinds of apparatus and structure behind it that you might like a lot better, that don't come with all that baggage. So it's something, I just don't think there's a simple one-size-fits-all sort of answer to some of these questions. I think on some level, we have to acknowledge the complexity of it. So there you go. It's not much of an answer.
No, I mean,
Messy.
I think that those things make sense. I can see, especially what you're saying, how people is like, well, that was my childhood.
Yeah.
And I think that that probably is the case for so many of the books that we have mentioned here tonight, all panelists and MT. Like, it's hard. I think that's one of the reasons people get so riled up, is these books are so connected to something core to you.
Mhm.
So it looks like some of the questions have been answered already via chat. So I will.
Not really. Go ahead and read it, Rebecca. I made
Okay. Okay.
I'm
Okay.
sorry,
Sorry, MT. I didn't mean to.
Megan.
I didn't mean to. Okay. So the question is from Rebecca. This question is for Mollie in regards to PFLAG Reading with Love and MT. My name is Rebecca, and I'm the president and founder of Autism Kids. We recently donated 500 inclusive books featuring autistic characters to CMS. We are trying to donate 100 books with autistic characters to CM Library, but aren't getting any answers as to what kind of books we can donate. Having run up against book bans during our CMS distribution, I was wondering whether book bans are a factor when nonprofits are trying to donate books. I know there's several factors when donating books, but I'll let you guys answer that how you will.
Mollie, did you want to go first?
Well, I just was gonna say, we have not really been on the donating side of this part. So like we've had, especially last year, a lot of nonprofits reached out to us, or like individuals reached out to us wanting to donate books to us. We haven't done it the other way around. So except to +1 Ashley's book recommendation, I don't have please go ahead, MT. I think you could answer this better than I can.
I don't know, Mollie. I tried to answer through an email response and wiped the question out, so that's not any indication.
Technical difficulties.
Yes, and thanks, Megan, for helping us out with this. Rebecca, I'm going to answer it with two answers. The first one is in the chat. I did send you my email address so that you can write to me and I can connect you with our collection development office so that you can speak with them directly. We do accept donations, and so passing it through me, I can help get you to the right person to do that. Why it may not have been answered, I'm not sure why the email address didn't go through, so getting mine will be helpful to you. But to answer your question, we do accept donations. We also tend to buy great books when we hear a great title. So even if you were to share some titles that you would like for us to include in our collection, we probably would buy them as well. So just reach out to me and I'm happy to do that, make the connection for you. And to the last question, book bans are, having run up against book bans during our CMS distribution, I was wondering whether book bans are a factor when nonprofits are trying to donate books. No, that is not a consideration for us. As I shared earlier, we have something to offend everyone. And so we would like to we try to be very inclusive in what we put in our collections. That's the first thing. So we want everyone to see themselves in their collection, in our collections. So that does not play a factor in it for us. And in fact, when some of our books are banned, they get heavy use and are greatly loved, and we have to go out and buy more of them. So rest assured that that is not a factor for us.
That is true. There's usually a long hold on books when they get some challenges. Mollie was asked a question. What would you say are newer books with LGBTQ plus representation that you think are powerful? She very nicely answered the person in the chat with a list of books, like an online source that I can send out in a follow-up email to everyone. And a favorite queer author of hers is Kristen Arnett. Did she write mostly dead things, or did they write mostly dead things?
Yes. That is, yeah. And yeah, that one with teeth, and I think she has a new one coming out soon too. But yeah, I love her. Yeah, but I would say like Goodreads also has really good like curated lists depending on if that's like your jam and you like to, I'm definitely an adult that loves that, like, and I get a sticker because I finished a book satisfaction of using Goodreads. But yeah, there's a lot of really good lists from queer organizations. with different stuff. And for nonfiction, I wrote in the chat, Before We Were Trans is a book that like a trans friend of mine recommended it to me and said, like, this book is church. Like, it's a really, really cool, in-depth historical look from like ancient Egypt up to now across the world, like different types of gender diversity in different places and different contexts, and sort of before and outside of the language that we use currently to talk about LGBTQ experiences.
Okay. Thank you for those recommendations, and I'll send these lists in the follow-up email as well. But that sounds so interesting. I'll put it on hold now before everybody else does. And then the last question, very neatly, is to Ashley, and it says, are there cases where you found yourself self-censoring your illustrations or being tempted to censor something you've drawn? Or can you imagine a scenario where you might ponder this? I think we heard your adamancy about, putting these stories out there, but we're all human. So I guess that's where this person is coming from.
Yeah, for sure. My way of kind of fighting these things is to just make what I want to make and not care what people think or say. I have so many stories in me that I want to tell, and I want kids to be able to tell me their stories and be able to confidently share the things that they want to say. So how can I expect them to do that if I don't do that myself? So I try to not self-censor. But like you said, I live in the world, I hear things, I'm on social media. So of course there's that like horrible thought that kind of creeps in sometime, that doubt, but I try to silence it and just tell the stories that I want to tell, because there's people out there who want to hear them. And like I said, I'm so very grateful to get to do a lot of school visits, and I get to chat with a lot of kids and read with kids. And that's my favorite job perk. And, I see them and I see their enthusiasm and their potential. And, when I'm in front of them, I am their role model. So I need to practice what I preach. So no, I'm going to confidently say I do not self-censor. I make what I want to make. And I can't wait to see all the stories that kids, put out into the world as they grow in their confidence and make what they want to make.
Belly buttons for everyone.
Let's do it. Belly buttons and outlets everywhere.
That's true. Very different things, but needed. That is the conclusion of, is it? Yes, that is the conclusion of the questions and the prizes. So I'm going to send it back to MT for closing remarks. And thank you so much for asking such thoughtful questions.
I almost made it through with managing my mute button, but missed one time. Thanks so much, Megan, for being my partner in this effort tonight. I really appreciate your being behind the curtain and making everything work for us. So that's great. As we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to thank not only our wonderful panelists, Mollie, Dr. West, and Ashley Belote, Mollie Burkholder. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and sharing your perspective on the work that you do and efforts to address censorship in all of your different venues. It is really appreciated. I'd also like to thank our Charlotte Mecklenburg Library Freedom to Read Week team, led by Mint Hill's library manager, Ann Mavian. They all worked together to put this event in front of us and for all of the events this week. And while we were trying this new opportunity with virtual Intellectual Freedom Week or Freedom to Read Week, we'd like to say, if you want to experience this conversation in person, not this particular one, but the same topic, we will have a different panel at South Park Regional this Thursday at 6 p.m. And again, it will be in person. So if you enjoyed it so much tonight, we'd love to see you out Thursday night at South Park Library. And from that, I'll say on behalf of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, I'd like to thank you all for your commitment to inclusion and equity. It is so important for us to have a diverse collection and a free, safe way for people to access information. Thank you all for fighting for informational freedom. Thanks so much and have a good evening.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.